And we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. Today I'm joined by Mary Wilkinson from the BBC in London. Thanks for being on the show, Mary. Welcome.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Really happy to be here.
So for my regular listeners and viewers around the world, you're probably wondering why I'm talking to the BBC today, especially specifically Mary. And so to fill you in on that, because I'm sure it's probably the big question that you all have right now, Mary, why don't you fill us in a bit about you and the backstory to why we are having this chat today?
Well, it was very nice of you to invite me, so thank you for that. I work for the BBC's international news services. So that's BBC World News, our international news and current affairs TV channel, and also for the BBC website, which covers news, features and sport. And I'm talking about something that we're very pleased with. It's a new series that we've recently launched looking at the history of global trade, told through, which sounds like quite a sort of dry economic subject, but what we've done is had a look at 8 different everyday products, starting with spices and going up to semiconductors, via handbags, bicycles, cut flowers. So products that people can relate to and that they use in their own life, and looked at the history of how those have been traded over the centuries in some cases, if you're talking about spices, or over the decades if you're talking about something like semiconductors, which obviously didn't come into being until the 20th century. And we've made 8 television documentaries and 8 really in-depth, beautifully illustrated digital documentaries, which are online. And together we're hoping that it will add up to a really in-depth illustration of how global trade has evolved over the centuries and decades and is still evolving, and what it does for economies around the world. It does make the overall economic pie grow, and it's sort of a basic human instinct from the beginning of time. We've traded with each other. So it's a great subject. It's allowed us to roam all over the world and sort of get into lots of detail, including some of my favourite subjects like designer handbags from Italy, or folding or electric bikes, which is the way the bicycle is evolving. So, yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I think this whole subject of global trade is one that I haven't actually explored before on the show. So I'm very keen to dive into the meat and the potatoes of this one. I mean, I think, if you think currently, let's talk about global trade. And obviously, America and China aren't exactly the best of friends. You got Trump and his cronies. I think according to my latest records, imposed tariffs of more than $360 billion of Chinese goods. And, these kind of things create ripple effects for economies all around the world. And ultimately, my audience are entrepreneurs, they're business owners, they're C-suite executives. And so it's very important for all of us as a community of business leaders and business people to understand what these implications are. Let's talk about that specifically. In your view, looking globally around the world, could you share with us what specifically do you see on the ground when these kinds of, country to country, America to China sort of trading wars, if you want to use that word specifically, when these kind of things happen between governments and economies of that scale, what are some of the ripple effects that you see at an SME or small business level locally in different markets?
Well, I mean, tariff wars have a chilling effect on global trade. There's no doubt about that. But the interesting thing is, before we started doing any in-depth research on this series, I think if you'd asked the group of us that were working on this what's happening to volumes of global trade, we'd have all guessed that they were going down, because the tariff dispute between China and the US has been running for more than a year now. You've got the ripples from Britain trying to leave the European Union.
That's a big one.
You've got another it's a big one. You've got another trade dispute, which hasn't had as much coverage, but it is having sort of serious implications between Japan and South Korea. So you might get the impression that global trade volumes are beginning to fall, but in fact, what's happening is the rate of growth is slowing down rather than overall volumes falling. So WTO, I think at the beginning of this year, were forecasting a 3% growth across the world in global trade volumes. They updated that in October to about 1.6, 1.7%. So it's not shrinking. It may yet happen. This is something that, everybody in business, as you say, will be watching, all governments, and certainly every business and economics journalist that I know is keeping a very close eye on this. But that's doing this series now was a good opportunity to just sort of stand back and think about trade. Why do we do it? What are the benefits? What impact is it having on different parts of the world? Because when you take a sort of a longer term view, you see some really dramatic stories like China has lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty in just 30 years. Did that between the 60s, 70s and 80s, I would say, was probably predominantly when that happened. And how did they do that? They did it by becoming the sort of manufacturing base for the rest of the world. And it was very much based around exporting goods to the rest of the world. South Korea, again, a dramatic transformation. I think people forget how much poverty there was in Korea excuse me, while I just clear my throat, in the 50s and 60s. And now South Korea is right up there in terms of per capita income. It's a very developed nation with a very good quality of life for most people on the salaries that they earn. And again, that was predominantly achieved through trading with the rest of the world. And it's a really big question for Africa because of the the whole continent of Africa, the demographics that you've got with such a young population and so many people coming into the workforce every year. Where are those jobs going to come from? There's a lot more that could be done in intra-Africa trade, but also, Africa almost certainly has to move beyond exporting commodities and move up the value chain and find products that it can export to other parts of the world, whether that's manufactured goods or services. So these are really big questions, and the advantage that we have at the BBC is that we've got correspondents all around the globe. We've got audiences all around the globe. We've got 42 language services, and we know that this is something that our audiences are really interested in, and we've got the sort of news gathering power to constantly be reporting on it. But every so often, rather than a sort of a snapshot in time, you want to stand back, paint a big picture, and tell a bigger story. And that's what we were hoping to do with Made on Earth.
Yeah. So why now, though? I know you touched on asking the question why. What was the answer that you guys? You obviously commissioned the entire series, I suppose. But why now? Why is this type of show relevant in your view today?
Because trade is such a hot topic, I think, and it's not just the talk of tariffs and trade wars and trade imbalances, but increasingly, when you look at global warming and concerns about the environment, and can everybody afford the sort of lifestyle that you have in America or Britain, if that were to be replicated across the world, would the world run out of resources? It throws up some really interesting questions about trade and our consumer society, and it would have been a good subject 3 years ago. It just happens to be a really good subject today, simply because it's so much in the headlines.
Yep, that's right. Okay, cool. So let's dive into some of the meat and the potatoes of the various episodes and angles to the subject of global trade that you guys covered. For instance, and I want to start with, obviously we're based in Africa. So one of the series, or one of the episodes within the series, is covering coffee from Africa. Do you want to walk us through what you guys discovered there?
Yeah, I mean, coffee is fascinating. It's loved by an awful lot of countries, but where you're seeing something really interesting is just how fast it's growing in China. So Chinese always used to drink tea, didn't really drink coffee, but it is now incredibly trendy to drink coffee in China, and you're seeing phenomenal growth. There was some amazing statistic, I'm probably going to get it wrong now because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but Starbucks are opening 15 new stores a week at one stage in China. And there are lots of indigenous Chinese companies creating cool little coffee chains, and we feature one of those in our episode Seesaw, which has opened 11 new branches, and they're beautiful, and they are selling the idea of artisan coffee, so you know where your coffee comes from. They're pushing the fair trade message, so you have the story of the farmer, you know the farmer is getting a good price, and this is increasingly what well-to-do Chinese urbanites want, which is very similar to the scene that you get in other big cities around the world. The climate change is affecting coffee. There's a very sort of narrow band around the equator where you can grow coffee where the conditions are good, but as the climate is changing, that band is shifting, and those established countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Brazil that grow coffee are having to adapt, change the variety of bean that they grow, and start moving into new territories where coffee might thrive better than it currently is. But the overall story is that demand is not going to go down, and it's whether the farmers can actually keep up with demand. And there's a whole other sector. It's not just the way you grow the beans and the quality of those beans. There's also real magic and alchemy involved in the way you roast the beans. And Italy really seems to have cornered the market in the place where they know how to make roasted beans taste extra special. So most of the beans that we drink in coffee chains around the world's biggest cities will have been roasted in Italy. But that's something that could happen anywhere. So, it's an interesting opportunity for, if you are growing coffee in places like Ethiopia, could Kenya, even Nigeria grows coffee. Could Nigeria become renowned for the way it roasts those beans, so simply supplying the raw bean?
Yeah. No worries. Well, look, I mean, one of the stats that I've got up in front of me here is that Ethiopia actually has about 40% of Africa's coffee production, which is massive. If you think about having 40% of any market share, especially something as, liquid as coffee. I mean, do you feel that, speaking to, coffee producers locally in Africa, do you feel that, their view is that they could take on more developed economies like Italian roasted coffee?
I think there's definitely people with that ambition, and we, in a different program actually, which we haven't broadcast yet, we're looking at entrepreneurship in Africa and what the obstacles are to entrepreneurs. And we're featuring a really interesting woman who started a coffee chain. She's only got 3 stores at the moment in Lagos in Nigeria. But what excited her was she realised actually Nigeria does grow coffee, and it could be growing more coffee, and that she's wise to the fact that you need a brand, you need marketing, you need to start selling the idea. Probably you start within your own market, patriotic Nigerians. We do this. I'm opening up 3 coffee shops that will supply you with really nice, good quality Nigerian grown coffee. And it will be really interesting to follow her over the next few years to see whether that takes off and, whether Nigeria does get to the stage where the quality of its roasting becomes as desirable as that perfect Italian cup of coffee that, has been around for decades. They've got the advantage of having done it for so much longer.
And how do you see, I'm fascinated by this. I spent some time in London at London Tech Week, and obviously we got clients as a company all over the world. But I'm interested to get your specific view on it, as the BBC, in terms of what is the international community's attitude towards trading with companies within developing economies in Africa. Are they positive? Are they viewing Africa as an opportunity, or are they viewing it as a no-go zone? What's the latest viewpoint on that one?
I would say it's mixed. I'm certainly sort of picking up keen interest from multinationals in operating in Africa, so they can see the potential and they know that the market is there. Whether it comes back the other way is harder to gauge, but I would imagine if somebody is producing a product that is genuinely different and of high quality, that's always a good story for anybody who, if it's going to a retailer in the West, knowing the backstory of where it's coming from, and certainly the interest around fair trade and people understanding that this is creating jobs, sustainable jobs at decent wages. If you can achieve all that, then, I think that does give an interesting marketing story, which must help in some of those developed economies.
Do you think fair trade has the influence that it needs to really move the needle locally in terms of job creation, economic stimulus, that kind of thing?
Fair trade is just part of the overall sort of economic landscape. And I do think with the sort of growing awareness and interest in the environment and sustainability, it's certainly a question that consumers increasingly in the West do ask themselves. But we all know that price is still the most important thing when it comes to persuading people to buy a product. So, fair trade is valuable, it's good, but offering goods at a price that people are prepared to pay in this world is obviously an extremely important factor.
Yeah, and you would think that Africa would dominate that one. Cost of production being lower, cost of labor lower, cost of resources lower.
Really interesting strategies. Ethiopia is determined to grow its economy by expanding its manufacturing base, and it's got a very good head start in that monthly wages in Ethiopia are very competitive now compared with monthly wages. It was certainly in China, but also in Asian countries where manufacturing has moved, like Bangladesh and Cambodia. Ethiopia at the moment is much more competitive.
Okay, cool. I want to dive into this particular angle here about spices from Asia. What's the story around that? So that's fascinating for me, because you would always, just from what we understand here about history, it was the Dutch East India Company used to trade spices and dominated that market massively. But it was always, India, Asia, it was always the spice capital of the world, and still is in many respects. But what is the story there today? What are some of the recent developments? What's the angle there?
So spice is very interesting, and because it goes back centuries, when you go back centuries with global trade, you find that it's a very sort of grubby, murky business with the imperial powers doing their best to profit. and slave trade sort of very intimately involved with trade centuries ago. But actually, the story now is a good one for India. So India still grows an awful lot of the world's spices because it's got the climate for it, and Indian cuisine is based on spices. It's a requisite. But what I find interesting is that India actually imports a lot of spices from places like Vietnam, which also has the climate for it, because they're so associated with spices that they've just built up an expertise in processing spices for export. And that these days is all about guaranteeing the purity, that it's not contaminated, checking for if something is being billed as organic, making sure it passes all the relevant tests, etc. So, India is both a big exporter of spices, but also a massive importer of spices, because it's got this value-added industry which employs tens of thousands of people. And that's really a really typical illustration of what happens to trade over time. It's moving up the value chain, and India has done that very effectively.
That's very interesting. I never would have said that. From the perception that you have, it's like, yeah, it's very interesting. And then let's talk about your favorite luxury leather handbags.
Well, this comes back to clever old Italy again. They have cornered the market in this, and again, looking at the history, Italy is renowned for the quality of its leather. So it's got very good tanneries, which gives you the good raw material for designer handbags. But it looks like the sort of made in Italy thing really took off because of the movie industry, and it was because Italy was a location in the 50s and 60s for making really glamorous Hollywood films. So Gina Lollobrigida and people like that, and even Audrey Hepburn. I think a number of her films were shot in Italy. And while the stars were there, they were being photographed by the paparazzi, and they were buying local handbags. And that sort of handbag over the arm, bit of an it bag, began to take off at that point, and made in Italy, designed in Italy, very desirable. And they've never lost that. And the statistics as well around handbags are really eye-opening. The fact high street handbags, so at the cheaper price point, most of those will be made in places like China, and the numbers of those will completely eclipse the number of designer handbags that are sold. But actually, in dollar terms, the number of sort of high street handbags, the size of that market is about $18 billion last year in 2018. But guess what the value of the designer handbag market was in 2018, which were only a fraction the number of handbags, but
much bigger market.
Yeah, it's $38 billion. So,
yikes.
$20 billion more for beautifully made handbags. Not all made in Italy, but a large number, a large percentage, I should say.
And tell me, is made in Italy the thing that gets you buying handbags, or are you looking at local manufacturers in London and England?
Do you know, I don't own a designer handbag, so I just lust after them.
I'll buy one for you.
I think I'm too, I'm far too tight to spend my money that way. But I do appreciate aesthetics and stuff that is well made. And I did have a Saturday job when I was a teenager, working in a very high-end department store. And I worked on the bag counter, so maybe that's just sort of stuck with me I like to feel I recognise quality when I see it.
I think you do. That's why you're on the Matt Brown Show, you know?
Yeah.
So I believe, according to what I've read here about the show, paper is making a comeback. Is that a thing?
Yes, it is a thing. So obviously, print in terms of newspapers, around the world, fewer newspapers are being printed, but books definitely making a comeback. They haven't suffered in the way that you might think they would do with e-readers and Kindles, etc. And the the greeting card industry is still going really strong. People are looking for something special, something handmade. They're willing to pay a bit more so that it feels special. And you still send something on your favorite social media platform or an email to somebody when it's their birthday, but it's also nice to hand something over. But the biggest growth area is in food packaging, because as plastic has become more of an issue in terms of what do we do with all this plastic that we're making, single-use plastic. Increasingly, fast food manufacturers are looking at sustainable alternatives, and that frequently involves paper. So companies that were producing plastic food packaging are switching over to paper.
That's very interesting, hey? That's very interesting. I never would have said that. I would have said print's dead, paper's dead. Done.
Paper's not dead.
Long live digital.
Very alive.
But it's fascinating how, but it's this whole dichotomy where one sort of, industry closes, another one opens, but it's still in the same category.
Yeah. And, paper was invented thousands of years ago, and the people that invented it were very clever. And it is a really good product, and it's pretty simple to make. And as long as you can grow your trees in a sustainable way, and the world is getting much better at doing that, then, why waste a good product?
So speaking of sustainability, one of the big things in trade in general is sustainable trade. What insights or lessons did you guys land on, or did you uncover throughout the production of this series as it relates to sustainable trade?
I think it's really obvious that everybody is thinking about it. So, I doubt there's a big company in the world that is not thinking about its carbon footprint now, because they know that their customers increasingly want to know what companies are doing to reduce their carbon emissions. For smaller companies, it's harder, but then smaller companies, their contribution will be a small blip. And collectively, it's probably not going to be governments that solve the issue about carbon footprints. It is probably going to be businesses. It's in their own self-interest, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, finding cheaper, more efficient ways of doing things, and just leaving a lighter footprint on the planet is something that every multinational is now looking at really hard. Here at the BBC, we're constantly aware of it, and we have a calculator now called Albert, which whenever we make a television production, we sort of look very hard at what our carbon footprint is as a result of that production. And it's a good discipline. It doesn't mean that you stop emitting carbon dioxide, because at the moment that's nigh on impossible. But simply by knowing what your contribution is, when you run the carbon calculator, it makes you think harder about it. Could we do this a different way? Do we really need to fly there? Could we get somebody local to do it? Is is there a more fuel efficient way of doing this? And it's not just the BBC. I think every large organisation is now doing that.
Yeah, it's certainly a shifting pattern in terms of, consumers driving the brand of these big companies, whatever that might be. Starbucks being one of them, Yeah. I think consumers are having a greater voice around what the role of the brand is in their lives now, and why they choose products, because they're spoiled for choice, and
brands completely understand that and are aware of it. And everybody is chasing the sort of Gen Z, Gen Y, and millennials. And they're the ones that whenever you do any public opinion polling, they're the most concerned about the environment. And, any brand knows that they need to appeal to that particular demographic. And part of appealing to that is to make sure that they are doing something genuine, not just window dressing about their sustainability.
Yeah, totally. Just a couple questions on this idea of shifting patterns. One of the points here is that, as a small business, if you're exporting something from Africa or from, wherever it might be, you don't really have the capacity to absorb the expense of sort of innovating and expanding. We're one of these companies trying to export our services over into the US and the UK next year. And when we, as a small SME, we don't have the luxury of big budgets. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it can often be incredibly difficult to get the right information, but the right partner to trade internationally. When you look at shifting patterns more broadly from, in terms of small companies looking to export services overseas or outside of their local territory, what are some of the trends that you see there?
Well, it has to be the sort of, it's not new, but it's digital transformation, the power of the internet. It allows you, and I'm not underestimating how difficult it still is, but it does allow small companies to get their brand in direct to consumer over the internet. That is still extremely difficult, but it is so much better than it was 20 years ago when you didn't have those channels, and you absolutely did have to find the right partner with the right distribution platforms or channels in another country. And if you're small, I can see how difficult that is. And certainly I think some countries are very effective at providing really good services for their small to medium size businesses by helping them with their embassy network, doing trade shows, giving them as much promotion as they can, knocking at doors for them. And if you come from a country that doesn't have those sort of resources or that sort of network, then you're definitely at a disadvantage. I can see that. But the internet, the amount of research you can do, the amount of reaching out to people, and the ability to use social media and maybe get in front of a customer base that you might not have been able to reach 2 decades ago, has got to give food for thought and reasons for optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we in London Tech Week, funny enough, we met, or I should say, I met a lot of the diplomats from the Department of International Trade. And, they've opened, I can't tell you, as a network that you don't have as an SME and as a partner. I mean, it's incredible to see how fast you can move things with no internet.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, people to people is still very effective.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So what's next? I mean, let's look into, the future of what trade's going to be. And as you say, digital transformation is a big enabler of trade in general. If you're not a digital business now, it's like, well, you don't have much runway left probably. And so looking forward, What have you learned, and what can you see developing in the near future?
I think it's going to be really interesting to my eye is on Africa, actually, because I think the story in Asia we're now familiar with, and that will continue. And you'll probably see, well, I hope you'll see, increasing prosperity. Probably, it's not going to be anywhere near as fast as Korea and China achieved, but you're already seeing increasing prosperity in places like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam. And I would love to see that across Africa. I think the whole world has a stake and an interest in African economies providing jobs for their growing populations. And Africa will be both a market for international brands and companies, but also it absolutely has to play its part in the economy, because otherwise it's not going to have the disposable income to be consuming other people's goods, but they should be making goods and services for the rest of the world. There's a lot of talent there. Africa's been hampered by lack of infrastructure. Power is probably the biggest thing to crack, so that you've got access to a reliable power supply, and also the ability to transport your goods easily across the continent of Africa as well as out of Africa. That's beginning to come. It requires a lot more investment, but nobody doubts that the brains, the initiative, the enthusiasm, the creativity exists there. I think having this conversation in 10 years' time will be really interesting to see what has happened and what has changed.
Great. We'll get you back in 10 years' time. Are you available?
Sure, I will be. Yeah.
All right, great. So Made on Earth, it is available on bbc.com/Made on Earth. Just so we end off, I want to ask you this, ask all my guests this, but why personally did you do this one? What's in it for you?
Do Made on Earth?
Yeah.
So I'm secretly quite a geek, and I love. So I started as a business journalist. I really think business is the sort of soap opera of life. It's got everything. You do see change. You see lives transformed. Everybody has got jeopardy. Is my business going to fail? Is it going to succeed? It's got a huge amount of luck is involved. It's just, if you're interested in stories and what makes the world go round, then business and trade sort of hit that on the head and give you lots of interesting human stories and a chance to look at what's happening around the world.
Great stuff. Mary, thank you so much for being on the show. I think it's kudos to you for covering this particular angle on global trade. I think it's a very important one, as we touched on right in the beginning of this episode, for everybody that's involved in business, whatever that might be. So that's bbc.com/Made on Earth, guys. Go and check it out. Mary, thank you for being on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks, Matt. All right. Bye.